and I'm committed to loving. I'm committed to giving my unique gifts. I'm committed to living my unique life. I'm committed to being a unique vector of radiance. I'm committed to walking in the world and by the very beingness in the depth of my story, right, calling people to the depth of their story. My goodness calls people to their goodness. My beauty calls people to their beauty. My truth calls people to their truth. Can you follow that with me? In other words, my entire life is about being, right, a radiant being, right, whose radiance allures and attracts. And I do that within the context of my story, whatever my story is. I'm very delighted to be here. And thank you for the beautiful Dharma recapitulation. And I know that there's also a whole group of people who literally just got back from being here at the center. I want to talk about three things today, which is primarily related to this idea, this commandment of live your story. This we've been talking for several years about what we might call the ontology of story. Now, ontology is a fancy word, and ontology means for realsies, right? For realsies. The ontology means it's for real, meaning it's not contrived. And when we say for real, what we mean is that it's rooted in the structure of reality. And when we say it's rooted in the structure of reality, we mean it's not just a random contrivance, but it's a quality of the real. And the real itself is animated by intention, by quality, by infinite depth, by sacredness. There's a sacredness to the real. And sacred means that it's not merely matter, but that it matters ultimately. So when we talk about the ontology of story, we're saying, my friends, parentheses, it's so good to be with you. Right? It's so good to be with you. For real. And parentheses. But second parentheses, for real, meaning not just a nice thing to say, not just a sweet feeling, but for real. Right? In the nature of the real, it's so good to be here with you. And second parentheses. Okay? So when we say story is a quality of the real, when we say that it's not merely a coincidence of matter, but that it matters ultimately, what we mean to say is that story is a quality of the universe. It's backed by the universe. And that, like all qualities of the real, it's rooted in the fundamental matrix of cosmological value. Meaning, we say it now simply, meaning human beings didn't make up stories. Story is not something which is a random expression of human life. You know, that humans created stories as means of accomplishing some mechanical end of survival. That sense doesn't make sense, right? In other words, human beings deployed stories, and there are many historians that try and view story that way. Reductionist, materialist historians who recognize the importance of story because they say, oh, wow, story is what coheres us. Story is how people created larger unions, right? The clan would tell a story, and the story was compelling enough that it attracted people, and the clan became larger and stronger. Or the tribe would tell a story, and the story became a mechanism for political union, which increased the power of the tribe. And the way they tell the story, the implication, but not only the implication, but the explicit claim, is that story is an accident of cosmos, because cosmos is an accident, right? In other words, we're living in a cosmos whose nature is accidental, it's non-purposeful, it lacks intention, it has no qualia, right? And even if there's some strange quality in which you can wake up to the inherent experience, right, of qualia, right? You can meditate, you can feel, right, this deeper kind of location of self. That itself is just one of the epiphenomena, one of the haphazard, ultimately non-meaningful coincidences of a cold cosmos. We live in a cold cosmos. Even if there are ostensible feelings of warmth, it's not a warm cosmos, it's a cold cosmos. And that cold cosmos has a chilling effect on our psyche, both personally and collectively. And that chilling effect, that freezing effect, is the root cause of every single personal crisis and of the meta crisis. So what we need to do is we need to reheat the universe. We need to disclose that the universe doesn't die in heat death, right? That actually consciousness, which is the core, or value, is real. Consciousness and value are the same thing. And value, right? Value is heating up. Value is getting deeper. Value is evolving. Value is expanding. And the expanding universe keeps expanding, right? And as I had a long conversation recently with my dear friend Howard Bloom, right? The notion of this inevitable heat death in which life, right, disappears is absurd, right? It's absurd on a number of levels, right? The fact that it's, billions or trillions of years away, and that it's used often, right, in writings on the universe to actually disclose that the universe is meaningful, right, is absurd by itself. But independent of that absurdity, the deeper absurdity is that the nature of time, the nature of dimensions, right? That is to say, time, space being one dimension, and our notion, right, of a cosmos that's interdimensional, right? We have an enormous amount of information across all of the interior sciences that indicate a multi-dimensional cosmos. So we have beings in the world that are not only extraterrestrial, not only not from our terresta, of which there's an enormous amount of information on that, right, which is pretty much irrefutable today if you're looking at the hardcore empirical information. We also have beings that are, right, in realities that are extra dimensional. That is to say, this dimension of reality is not the only dimension. And that story is a quality of cosmos that is not just terrestrial and not just dimensional. Story is an ontology of cosmos. It's a for realness of cosmos. It discloses something essentially real about reality. Now, just to give you a sense of the extra dimensional, and then I'll bring it directly back to story. So next week here in One Mountain, we're going to do the first ever memorial for my dear beloved friend Sally Kempton, aka Swami Durgananda, right, which was her name for a long period of time. In the last 25 years of her life, she returned to her primer named Sally Kempton, was, to my mind, the best meditation teacher we had in the world, right, for a couple of decades. And her book on meditation, Meditation for the Love of It, I think is the single best book ever written on meditation. And Awakening Shakti, right, a book about the Hindu goddesses, right, is a book filled with insight and transmission and goodness and beauty. And Sally was, in essence, a co-founder, a co-convener of the center, which is the kind of mothership of One Mountain, Many Paths, was, you know, the most beloved friend, and held us and held everything we did, and held the vision of the center, and held its depth, and held its exoteric dimensions, right? Its kind of public mission and its esoteric dimension as a mystical society. So Sally died a year ago, and I remember the text I received that she was gone, and I was in the house by myself. You know, my beloved Christina Kincaid was out, and I just began screaming in the house. It was and is unbearable. And yet Sally's obviously not gone. In other words, and I want to give you just a transmission of a sentence, if I can, with your permission. If Sally was ever here, meaning here in reality, I'm not talking about this dimension, she was in reality. If Sally was ever in reality, if the encounter with Salliness was ever real, then it's still real. Then she's still here. If there ever was Sally, then Sally exists now. And I want to just ask a question. How many people can get that? How many people get a sense of what that means? It's a direct, just think about it. If Sally was ever here, she's here now, period. Don't think about it. Don't logic it. Don't go to cognition. This is beneath cognition. It's beneath cognition. If she was ever here, she's here now. Right? In other words, when I encountered Sally, and I encounter her directly, and her depth and her presence and her qualia, right, in its infinite dignity and beauty, it's not gone. It's here. It can't have gone anyplace. I spoke to her the night before, right, just a few hours before she passed. And then what happened was she passed from this dimension, this available dimension, into another dimension, because the story goes on, because story is real. Does that make sense, everyone? Story is real. Story is real. If Sally would have disappeared, you tracking with me, everyone? It's direct. If Sally would have disappeared, then she never would have been here, and story would not be real. But we actually have a direct experience of the utter and infinite reality of a never-ending story. Now, our Kashmir Shaivite friends, Kashmir Shaivism being the root tradition of Hinduism, so they speak of this elliptically, indirectly, by, speaking of, these kind of millions of karmic, right? Millions of karmic cycles of incarnation and reincarnation, reincarnating again and again and again and again. What they're pointing to is the never-ending nature of the story. And they're pointing to, actually, although they don't even realize often that they're doing it, but they're pointing to the ontology of story, that it goes on. Even Buddhism, which works so hard to tell us in its exoteric teachings, often misunderstood by the teachers themselves who are teaching it, and they tell us, move beyond your story. How many people have heard that? Move beyond your story. Move beyond your story. Actually, then reintroduce story through the back end and tell us about some form of reincarnation of some kind of unique pattern or configuration that is the human being that gets somehow transmitted in reincarnation. So in essence, story comes in through the back door. Does that make sense, everyone? Story is an ontology of reality. Story is real. That's critical. That's critical. And So one of the implications of this notion of story being real is that it's not over when it's over. It can't be over because story participates in eternity. Story is not a quality of the temporal, right? Story is the paradoxical face of eternity. We think that eternity means that you leave story behind. No, story is the face of eternity, which is why the book of creation, what's called the Sefer HaYetzirah, a text that we've mentioned here before, the Sefer HaYetzirah, the book of creation, talks about reality as being mispar, number, mispar, M-I-S-P-A-R, number, and sipur, story, and sefer, text, book, the book, which implies sapir, which is sapphire, which is kind of the blue meditative light, which I'll return to, and safar, boundary. So there's these series of words, right? And Talia will try and catch them all with me. Krista and Talia, thank you. Right. So what this text is saying is that that reality is engraved with eternity, which is the quality of the real. Eternity, which is not everlasting time, but that which is beneath time and space. Eternity is engraved with the qualities of the real, and the qualities of the real are mispar, which is number. And one of the ways we experience that reality is not happenstance, that reality is not merely random. It's not merely random. And that whatever spontaneity and surprise exists in cosmos takes place within the context of a larger telos, of a larger order. One of the ways we understand and experience that is through the mathematical values of cosmos. Mathematics itself lives on the border between the interior and the exterior. Mathematics is the ghost in the machine. Mathematics indicates a coherent cosmos in which numbers themselves are intimately related to each other, and they are unfolding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're unfolding in a storyline, in a direction. And as the numbers come together, they form coherent configurations of intimacy, right? Which disclose the telerotic universe, the universe that is filled with eros, with radical aliveness, seeking deeper contact, desiring deeper contact, and generating greater wholeness. That's the nature of mathematics. So mathematical value discloses the intimate universe, which is a storied universe. All numbers are telling a story. So mispar is a story, number one. It's beautiful. Stay close. Stay close, stay close, stay close. Mispar, right, is telling a story. So mispar, which is number, is not separate from sipur, which is story. And just like mathematics discloses value, right, the value in mathematical equations, the values in mathematical equations, which are the equations of exterior science, but which participate in interiors, right? In other words, mathematics lives at the border, right, in the liminal space, in the space in between interiors and exteriors. So too, in the more classical interior sciences, the sciences of interiors, in which we also have equations, and those are what we have called in cosmorotic humanism, in this new book, First Principles and First Values, right, we've called the interior science equations. And there are first order and second order equations. And we formulated about 17, 18 interior science equations in which there are values in the equations. So there's an Eros equation and there's an intimacy equation. So we say Eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact and ever larger wholeness, or intimacy equals the experience of shared identity in the context of otherness, bracket relative otherness, times mutuality of recognition, mutuality of times mutuality of feeling, pathos, times mutuality of value, times mutuality of purpose, those two equations. You don't have to follow the details now, but the point is, in those equations, or whether it's the equation of transformation, or right, those equations are disclosing of value in cosmos, which are intrinsic values of cosmos. And here's the key, right? Value is real. Value is real. Value is a real structure of cosmos. So I just want to say that value is real. I'm going to scream this from the rooftops. Value is real. And story is a value of cosmos, right? Does that make sense? Story is a value of cosmos, right? In other words, story, which means that the experience of reality is most accurately disclosed as story. Story matters because story is what matters, because it's not merely matter. Story is the disclosure of the inherent Eros value of cosmos. In other words, it's not just that really it's about truth, but truth dresses itself up in story to make itself available. No, it's not exactly like that. There's an old fable about truth that, was running around naked, and everyone was shied away from truth. And story was, gathering all these huge crowds. And so one day naked truth walks into, adorned story, garbed story, dressed story, who's surrounded by crowds. And when naked truth runs in, everyone runs away. So naked truth and adorned, garbed, dressed story are left just with each other. And naked truth says to story, I'm so devastated. Everyone's kind of thronging and gathering around you. When I walk in, everyone runs away. And story says to naked truth, no, let me share with you my clothes. We're not supposed to be separate. We're supposed to walk together. We're inseparable from each other. And from that moment on, naked truth and dressed story became one. And truth and story are inseparable. It's deep. It's deep. Let me see if we can kind of get this. Story is the very structure of reality itself. And story lives all the way down and all the way up the evolutionary chain. Right? And we talked about this about 4 weeks ago in One Mountain. We talked about the elements of story. And that actually, if you actually understand the subatomic world, you have the proto-elements of story, right? You have the causal relationship between events, meaning reality is not just constant conjunction, things that happen to be happening, but there's an inherent intrinsic relationship between events that form a thread. And that thread is called story. 1, 2, that what drives that causal thread is desire. Right? There's inherent desire, right? So story is a value of cosmos, and all stories are stories of desire, and desire itself is a value of cosmos. Okay, that's 2. 3, all desire is desire for value, for more value. Desire is a desire for a future that can be deeper and more than the present is. So I enter into the depth of the present, and from the depth of the present, I dream, I desire a better future. That is the voice of evolution. That's the voice of transformation. It's the developmental voice. It's the yearning to be deeper, to be ever more present, to be ever more alive, to be ever more good, to be ever more true, to be ever more beautiful. It's the storied nature of desire. Desire desires more value, desires the story to unfold and disclose more value. So desire is always a desire for more value. 4, right? Within story, there's a quality of freedom, of choice. There's some sense in which I have the capacity to turn towards. Now, there's an early experience of choice when a primeval organism turns towards a glucose gradient. But choice evolves. There's more and more freedom in the system. There's more and more awareness of the system. That's the movement from unconscious to conscious evolution. Choice evolves. The clarification of desire evolves, and story evolves. So stay close. At the foundational levels of reality, choice seems to be almost an intrinsic, almost a mechanical function of cosmos seen from the outside. Because we can only see the early levels. We can only look at the early levels of cosmos, let's say the world of matter, the world of the quantum world, the subatomic world, the atomic world, the molecular world. We can only look at them from the outside. Because although all those quanta, all those atoms, all those molecules live in us, but we experience them through a much later stage of emergence, right? The human stage. So we can look at it from the outside. Looked at it from the outside, we both see both the dimensions of interiors. We see the dimension of desire between, let's say, proton, neutron, electron that desire that forms an atom. But we see it from the outside, so it can appear we can miss if we're blinded dogmatically, right? And we make a dogmatic, non-empirical, anti-empirical, dogmatic faith statement and say the world's materialist. We could look at those early levels of reality as being mechanical and miss their music, as Nietzsche correctly pointed out. No, there's music. There's the music. There's the first bars of music of choice, the first bars of music of desire. But desire in the early stages of cosmos, right, is so structural. We don't have an interior experience of actually clarifying desire, right? Story is the nature of what happens. We're seeing it retrospectively through our scientific instruments, right? Our inductive and deductive instruments that amplify our knowing, and we're seeing it from the outside. And it could almost seem mechanical until we go beneath the words and we understand. And when we're talking about gravity, gravity is not mechanics. Gravity is allurement. Electromagnetic fields are allurement. Higgs boson, right, are structures and configurations of allurement and attraction, right? Balances between allurement and autonomy that generate new vectors of emergence, right? But as we evolve, as reality evolves, right, then the proto seedlings, right, of choice and story, right, and desire, right, become more and more apparent. And we begin to see how we actually, as we finally get all the way through the biological and then into the human level, the third Big Bang, we go from matter to life, biology to mind, right, to the noosphere, as the early Russian cosmists called it, right, the world of mind culture, the depth of the self-reflective human mind. We begin to see, right, choice, right, coming on board more clearly. We begin to see, right, our capacity to clarify our desire, to move from pseudo desire to authentic desire. We begin to see our ability to see the plot lines of our story as we kind of move ever more deeply, right, into the layers, the unfoldings, the structures of unfolding consciousness that are not a linear line, but more like waves, right, of unfolding consciousness, right? And we begin to discern and experience, right, more capacity for choice, right, more and more freedom. We begin to actually experience our capacity to clarify our desire, to move from pseudo desire to authentic desire. We begin to see more and more of the outline of our story. And then as we kind of evolve more deeply and we transform more deeply, we begin to be able to hold a wider and wider story until we actually have an experience of what was called conscious evolution. And my beloved wholemate Barbara Marx Hubbard spent her life kind of championing some version of conscious evolution. And Barbara and I spent the last 4 or 5 years of her life clarifying together a new vision of conscious evolution, right? Which is conscious evolution means, right, that we can, number one, see the whole story. We can see the entire story. Conscious evolution means we can see the whole story of evolution. So our conscious evolution means that our capacity to see the wider story expands, number one. Number two, conscious evolution means our capacity to see ourselves within the context of the larger story. Meaning I don't see myself just as me, my friend, my early childhood, my early trauma, where I live, my socioeconomic status. I see myself, my unique personal self, within the larger vector and storyline of evolution. But I see myself right, as a unique emergent from the very first moment of the Big Bang and from before the Big Bang, when the infinite, intimate will of cosmos intended the Big Bang, and then it unfolded through levels of matter and life to the depth of the human self-reflective mind, and ultimately came to the reality, choosing, desiring, needing, love, adoring, intending, recognizing me. I actually, conscious evolution means I self-understand, right, my own self as being personally implicated in the larger thread of evolution. My capacity to see that is the emergence of a new quality of consciousness, which we've called in cosmoerotic humanism Homo Amor. Homo Amor. Anyone who remembers the history, right, as we developed this name Homo Amor, which is this capacity for conscious evolution. But number 3, in conscious evolution, I realized that none of it was ever by chance. It's not as in the old version, right, of conscious evolution, what Barbara used to talk about, that before the human beings, it was evolution by chance. Now it's evolution by choice. As Barbara and I studied together, that was actually an early vision of conscious evolution, was actually mistaken. It was never by chance. There was always an inherent set of plot lines in cosmos. But now those plot lines are coming alive. And the plot lines of cosmos are the first principles and first values of cosmos. And those first principles and first values are the plot line of the larger story, and they're the plot line of my story, because my story and the story of evolution are the same. Ultimately, they're following the same pattern. I am a unique chapter and verse in the larger story, right? Which means that the ultimate command of my life, and it's so freaking stunning, right? The ultimate command of my life is to live my story. What reality, right? The great clarion call of reality is live your story. And live your story means clarify your story. That's the word sapir. Sapir is sapphire, right? And sapphire is a description from what today people would call a medicine journey, but it's not a medicine journey catalyzed only by the ingestion of substance, although sometimes that helped. But it's a medicine journey catalyzed by a turn towards the interiors, when I actually experience, right, myself in full play with reality. So I'll tell you something funny, okay? Can I tell you something funny? Okay. So about 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Last night, my fever was raging at about the same level it's raging right now. So I take no responsibility for anything we're saying. And I couldn't sleep. So I said, okay, right, there's a favorite director of mine who I like his movies, but his new movie is called something like The Challenger. And it's about a tennis player, right? So it's the story about a tennis player, a woman who's a fantastic tennis player, and 2 men who are kind of the love interests of her life. And in the beginning of the movie, there's a set that she plays. What's her name? I don't remember her name. In any case, there's a set that she plays. Tasha's her name. And in this set, which she wins 50 love, there's this moment, and she completely trounces, smashes her opponent, who throws her racket and, seems to be this bitter loser. But actually that happens one day, and then that night there's a party, and these 2 guys who have never met her come to the party. She's this kind of, up and coming, college tennis player. And the 3 of them are talking, and this is the beginning of a kind of a lifetime of love interest between the 3 of them. And, there's this moment where she turns to them and says, I'm a tennis player. And what she means by I'm a tennis player, she means I'm an artist on the inside of life. And what does she mean? How does she say that? She said there was a moment in that game that she had played the morning, which these guys had watched, where she had trounced her opponent, 50 love. There was a moment where she says there was about 15 seconds in the game. We were totally together, where nothing else mattered. We were playing. He doesn't use these exact words, but you can go watch the movie. It's in the first third of the movie where we were playing, on the inside of the inside, right? And there we were together, and the whole world disappeared, and we were in complete intimacy. And she says we were in love. This is her and her opponent on the court, right? We were in love. It wasn't about who won and who lost. It's we were in the depth of the story together. We were there together, and it wasn't about what our parts were. That's what it means to be in your story. To be in your story, it's not about whether you're a captain or a prince or a pauper or a general, right? Right? It's about how you play. Do you play with everything? Do you meet, right? Is there a depth of an encounter, right? When you're with each other and you're deep in relationship with life and self, and you're at your best and you're meeting, right? In the depth of ultimate encounter, right? And she describes it. And one of the guys, who's Patrick, doesn't know what she's talking about. And the other one, whose name I think is Art says, oh, he says, that's when you screamed. And indeed, we remember from that morning, there's this moment where she just screams as if in the throes of sexual ecstasy, she screams. And she looks at him and she realizes he gets it. And ultimately, they marry, but the three of them continue to have this complex relationship. And in any case, there's this long, twisted, tortured, tempestuous love triangle, which kind of, in the end, many years later, 13 years later, kind of brings them back together. Patrick has become a very, very low-ranked player, and Art, right, has become one of the highest-ranked player, but he's kind of lost some of his game. He's now married to Natasha Tatashi, and somehow Tashi arranges so that they play each other, and they have this very intense game, which then begins another arc of the story in which they wind up moving through game after game until finally they're playing each other at this championship game, right? And there's a whole web that takes place of signals, right? What had happened the night before is Tasha had gone to Patrick and asked Patrick to throw the game so that Art could regain his confidence. Patrick agrees, but then on court kind of reneges on the agreement and makes a signal with his racket to his friend Art, because these guys were close friends, that he actually slept with Natasha the night before. Art is stunned, doesn't allow Patrick to throw the game, allows him to catch up. And then here's what happens. And then something happens, and they start volleying back and forth. It's the end of the movie. They start volleying back and forth, and they start smiling. They're smiling. And then Natasha wakes up. She's watching the side of the game, and she sees them both. And then now they're playing. Now they're on the inside, and all anger has disappeared, and all pettiness has disappeared, and all of the contraction has disappeared. And they are in their game, which is their story. And they realize that they're actually loving each other. The two men are loving each other, and they're loving Tasha, and Tasha's loving them. And then there's this moment where they both leap for the ball. They both leap for the ball, and they wind up, right, embraced in the air, right, on the, kind of embraced, and they are both leaping for the ball. And then Tasha gets up and screams in ecstasy with them. That's it. That's what it means to be inside of your story. It means you're playing with everything you've got. And it doesn't mean the plot doesn't matter, and it doesn't mean, right, Eros and ethos are one, and it's all Eros value. But for sure, and there's a way in which you enter into your story, and you realize that the whole thing from beginning to end is, are you living your story? Right? The commandment of Cosmos, right, is to live your story, because Cosmos is made up of stories. That's what Cosmos is. Cosmos is story. That's what this text, the Sefer Yetzirah, is saying. The Sefer Yetzirah is saying there's the mathematical value, right, of reality. That's mispar, number. But mathematics itself is disclosing mispar, the root word for number, has the same root word of story. Mispar, number, discloses sipur, story, M-I-S-P-E-R, mispar, number. discloses Sippur, S-I-P-P-U-R, story. Number and story are same. There's the mathematical values of the exterior science equations, and then there are the values of the mathematics, right, of the interior science equations, and both sets of mathematics are mathematics of intimacy. And the nature of intimacy is story. Intimacy means story. That's what it means, right? Intimacy, by its very nature, it's an intimate universe, means it's a storied universe. Right? And the tragedy of postmodernity is the destoring of reality. Right? When you can't follow, right, the thread line of your story. Right? Story matters, right? There's a passage, right? If you want to get the kind of the kind of how postmodernity kind of went wrong, I'll give you just two texts. One text is from, Carlos Castaneda in Journey to Extelon, right? He puts it in the mouth of Don Juan, and this is kind of the moment of Don Juan's realization, where Don Juan says, I had a terribly strong attachment to my personal history. I honestly felt that without my personal history, and I'm adding my personal history, that's what he's referring to, my life had not continuity or purpose. I don't have personal history anymore. I dropped it one day when I felt it was no longer necessary. That is precisely wrong. In other words, at the level of separate self, there's a separate self grasping ego, which gets lost in the recursive loops of the old stories, that in fact needs to drop the pettiness and contraction, right, of dimensions of the ego story. That's true. There's a separate self level of story where I've got to drop the story, where I get lost in the obsession of story. And I always remember a couple who came into me when I first became a rabbi, when I was like, I don't know, God, whatever it was back in the day. And I was in Florida, in Palm Beach, right, at this congregation, Palm Beach County. And this couple comes in, they're in the middle of this fierce argument. And it takes me about 20 minutes to realize they're arguing about something that happened, right, literally 43 years ago, right? And they're stuck in what happened then. So there's a story you got to drop. And then I get to true self, and true self is the field of value. I realize value is real, and true self is there's a field of value that we all live in. And notice I'm not calling it a field of consciousness. Consciousness is a confusing word. There's a field of value. It means there's a realness to the universe, right? There's a quality to the universe. And consciousness is too elliptical a phrase. There's a concrete value, realness. Reality matters. Ultimately, it's not matter, it matters ultimately. That's true self, which we're now redefining in cosmologic humanism. We're not calling it the field of consciousness, we're calling it the field of value desire, or if you will, the field of Eros value, which is really what consciousness means. And then I go from separate self to true self, then I go to unique self, and unique self is when I reclaim story. I reclaim the ultimate and infinite personal dimension of story. I reclaim the infinities of personhood. This is the personal beyond the ostensibly impersonal. This is the music that animates the mechanics. This is the ultimate intimacy of personal story, which is the constitutive nature of reality itself. Reality is story. And I'll read you another text just to kind of, you get the breakdown of reality is always the breakdown of story. The person who felt this breakdown of story kind of in this proto postmodern moment was Kafka. And Kafka writes, in my favorite book of his is called The Trial. And the plot of the novel is an intentionally impossible path. And I'm reading here from a book called Soul Prince. Okay, it's a great book. I love it. Right. And so we're reading about this book by Kafka, The Trial, the thread of meaning phrase. And at points when the storyline seems in reach, it slips out of grasp again, like a lure drawing the reader along. I'm reading on page 16 of Soul Prince. Frustration, anger, and a radical hopelessness gradually build in the reader as Kafka subjects us to the very feeling that his protagonist, K, that's the name of the protagonist, undergoes as he's arrested. For what and by whom, he doesn't know. Every time K detects a glimmer of sense in the proceedings, it vanishes into nonsense. K is overwhelmed and incapable of making sense or telling his story, tortured by a nonsensical system of bureaucracy and human inanity. In an all too apt passage, Kafka captures how we all feel on occasion about our lives, but more importantly, how the postmodern predicament has actually colonized our lives. We've actually lost the plot lines of our story. What postmodernity has told us, which is taken to be a given in the academy, is that no stories are real, that value is not real, and therefore there are no stories of value that are backed by the universe. And therefore, we cannot be sane, because sanity is to know my true nature, and my true nature is to know that I am a unique storyline in the plot line of Cosmos. I'm a unique expression of the Cosmos's plot lines that live in me uniquely. I'll read you from Kafka. Kafka writes about the collapse of the modern human being. And he writes, quote, about K, the protagonist in the story. He writes, he was too tired to survey all the conclusions arising from the story. The simple story had lost its clear outline. He wanted to put it out of his mind. Right? Wow. How'd you get that? Right? Kafka, right? Kafka, he's living in this explosion, right, in which value is said not to be real, because modernity rebels against the distortions of value in pre-modernity. Pre-modernity got that value was real. Pre-modernity got that value was real, but then it said value is owned by, hijacked by various fundamentalist groups. So that's not the field of value. That's a hijacking. If I say my particular form of Christian fundamentalism owns value, right, then I'm not in the field of value. If I say my particular Sunni or Shiite form of value owns the field of value and no one else is in the field of value, I'm not in the field of value, right? Any group, right, that claims that actually to murder someone outside of my group is not murder, right? There's something fundamentally qualitatively different about murdering someone who's outside of my group. That's not considered murder, right? Then they're not in the field of value. Right? Anyone who steps out of a universal grammar of value that applies to all living things is not in the field of value. So postmodernity recognized pre-modernity, recognized that value was real, right? But then said, no, it's owned by me, and value is commanding me to ultimately subject you, right, to my interpretation of value. That's false. So modernity screamed against that. Modernity screamed for a possibility of articulating a world reality not based on these hijacked, ethnocentric, homophobic, anti-body, anti-art, right, anti-human reason at its best modalities. But then modernity itself stepped out of the Tao. And the Tao is, in our reading, the Tao is the field of value. And modernity said there's no value that's real. And then the plot line got lost. We destoried the universe. When you destroy the universe, right, that's the disqualification of the cosmos, right? Then we destroy the universe. The destroying of reality destroys reality. Reality is story. And I want to just say something very, very, very serious and very real, right? The inability today for people to discern between the good actors and the bad actors, right, in certain stories. With all the complexity, there's still good actors and bad actors, right? And I'm going to say something unpopular, right? There's a lot to say about the complexity of the United States and about the complexity of Israel, right? That's for sure true. And, right, in the Middle East today, there is zero moral equivalence between a pluralistic democracy, right, called the State of Israel, which empowers women, which 20% of its population, right, is non-Jewish and is integrated in every dimension of daily life, in the army, on the Supreme Court, right, in the parliament, doctors, nurses, hospitals, right, grocers, farm keepers, right, an integration unlike any that's ever been achieved in world history, despite pressures on the state that are unimaginable, this tiny little state. And to suggest, right, some sort of moral equivalence between that position, right, and Hamas, which is basically a philosophy of death, which says we are the only value, right? And driving nails into women's vaginas, right? Again and again and again, as they're raped and their breasts are cut off, right? Are systematically, not because they've gone berserk or crazy, systematically as an expression of the degradation of human life. And then to have that misunderstood and endorsed, right? Professors at American universities screaming out, right? Yes, exhilaration by professors at American universities, right? Protests, glory to our martyrs, right? By upper middle class, right? Kids, right? All over the world, right? Who basically don't get that the field of value is real and can't follow a storyline and can't actually track what's happening, right? Is the breakdown of story. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. Conflicts like that are the one that's going on in Israel today, or like what's going on in the Ukraine, are the burning canary, right, in the mine shaft. Right? The canary in the mine shaft tells us, right, in that image, in that metaphor, you put a canary down the mine shaft to see is the air poison. When the canary starts burning, you know the mine is filled with poison. It's always been true, right? That the nature, there's certain conflicts, right, that disclose where reality is. And in this particular moment, these conflicts are those conflicts. Let's bring it back to center. Live your story. That's the commandment of Cosmos. Why is that the commandment? Because the outline of my story is everything. It doesn't mean I live in yesterday. So let me try and go to the last step and explain, what does it mean to live my story? What does it mean to live my story? To live my story means A, to embrace my story. I've got to embrace it. I can't try and be in another story. For whatever reason, Cosmos placed me in this story. 1, embrace my story. 2, from the place of embracing my story, what is the heroic transformation that I can accomplish in my story? What is within my story? There's a transformation. Within my story, there's a journey. Within my story, there's a heroic invitation to transformation, to deepening, to becoming whole. There's a heroic invitation to weave together the split up parts of my story, to take my fate and turn it into destiny, to take my brokenness and let it break me open, to realize that there's nothing more whole than a broken heart and a broken story, and to turn my story in all of its pain, right, into something that's potent and powerful. Now, that's a big deal. That's the move from victim to player, right? So the second step is, right, I would call the second step, I embrace my story, right? And then, right, in the second step, I recognize in my story the pain and the beauty. I recognize the gifts and the god-awful travesty. I recognize the places I've been hurt and bullied, right? And the ways that I've been blessed, right? And held, right? And as I hold those together, and then I go on a journey. Life is not an event. Life is a journey. It seems like a simple statement. It's not. Life is a journey. It's not an event. It's not a series of events. That's what we mean. Life is not a series of numbers, right? Numbers are story. And when I connect the dots of the numbers, I disclose the story. And I understand that there's no event of my life that stands independently. What we do is we freeze frame on a particular event, and then we keep reliving that event, either positive or negative, again and again. Life's not an event, it's a story. I've got to connect the events, which are the dots, right? If you will, the numbers, and connect those dots, and I disclose the pattern, the direction of my story. And once I connect my story, then I begin to embrace my sacred autobiography, the unique story of my life, right? When I embrace the unique story of my life, then I can begin transformation, right? And that let's call transformation, if you will, 3. What's the unique transformation that's mine? What's the unique tikkun, the unique fixing that's mine, right? How do I actually turn pathology into mythology? How do I mythologize, not pathologize? Right? Actually realize that my story is a great myth, but myth not in the sense of untrue, but it's my mythic life, which is my storied life, which is the unique story of my life, right? And then I engage in my unique transformation, my unique tikkun. And the key to that story, the key practice is mythologize, don't pathologize, right? Mythologize, don't pathologize. And that phrase, which comes from the literature of heroes' journeys, right, is the realization that there's a great life that I have to live, that my life is called in the lineage text of the lineage of Solomon, it's called my unique letter in the cosmic scroll. That's my myth. That's my mythology. It's my unique letter in the cosmic scroll. It's a big deal. And my unique letter in the cosmic scroll is the great story of my life, right? In which I realize I am a king and a queen. I'm a prince and a princess, right? I'm a lord and a lady. I am literally royalty. If I don't experience myself as royalty, I am in self-delusion. I am literally ontologically royalty. I'm a good child of the universe. I'm a good child of the king and queen of the universe. And the king and queen of the universe are not regressive fantasies. They're the ontologies of reality in which the divine or the field of meaning is the infinite personhood of reality. That's what we talk about, the king and the queen. It's the good king and the good queen. It's the goodness of reality itself. And I am a good child of the good queen. I'm a prince and a princess, and I am royalty. And I experience myself as royalty. So I engage in that unique transformation, which is my unique tikkun. And that unique transformation, which is the unique tikkun, is within the context of my story and my loyalties, as opposed to my lies, right? And my I don't talk even about loyalties and lies. I would say I hold the appropriate interiorities of my life, right? I hold the appropriate privacies of my life, right? And from that place of a deep interiority, a deep privacy with my own internal heroism, I turn to the public, and this is step 4, and I offer my gifts. And I'm committed to loving. I'm committed to giving my unique gifts. I'm committed to living my unique life. I'm committed to being a unique vector of radiance. I'm committed to walking in the world, and by the very beingness in the depth of my story, right, calling people to the depth of their story. My goodness calls people to their goodness. My beauty calls people to their beauty. My truth calls people to their truth. Can you follow that with me? In other words, my entire life is about being, right, a radiant being, right, whose radiance allures and attracts. And I do that within the context of my story, whatever my story is. Wow. Wow. Okay. So let's, with that, and let me just ask a question, everybody. Does everyone have a little bit of a better sense of what we mean, live your story? Why there's a command to live your story? Well, living your story is actually a command. There's a command, live your story. That's what I'm commanded to. So there's no guru. It's why we're anti-guru, right? The guru is the field of value. And the field of value dresses itself or incarnates, not even dresses itself is the wrong way to say it. The field of value incarnates uniquely in your story. And your story embodies value uniquely. And you and I have an ability to evolve value uniquely and beautifully. Right? And so that's what Dickens meant, I believe, by being the hero of your own life. And sometimes it's what I meant before about privacy. Sometimes that heroism is witnessed and recognized and celebrated by the whole world. But often it's not. Usually it's not. Usually it's celebrated and witnessed by perhaps our community, but often it's not even that. So there's a band around us that we gather, and that band witnesses us, and it might be a friend or two friends. It might be a band of outrageous lovers. It might be a mystical society, which is what we are in some sense. And we witness each other. We hold each other. We call each other, right, to the best and deepest fulfillment of this command of cosmos, right, to live your story. And to live your story is not to get lost in a kind of narcissistic kind of revisiting of wounds again and again. Right? It's not a denial of wounds, but the wound becomes the ground for my greatness. Right? The wound becomes the warp for my wonder. Does everyone understand? Right? The breaking becomes the breaking open, right? That invites me, right, to the possibility of my life. And my life is always about devotion. It's always about, oh my God, right? How can I be devoted to you? How can I love you? How can I love you open? How can I receive your love more deeply so that you'll know that you have the capacity to love? How can I bring more beauty into the world? How can I bring more radiance into the world? How can I bring more art into the world? How can I shine a light into the unique dark corners and crevices, right, that live in my circle of intimacy and influence? How can I stand on the abyss of darkness and say, let there be light? And how can I take my holy and broken hallelujah, right, and know that it doesn't matter what you heard, right? There's a blaze of light in every word.